Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. I was saying good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Shazia Vlahos. I am the head of communications for the Toronto Catholic District School Board. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. As you know, this is the second of our Lunch with the Director Facebook Live YouTube stream series. So I want to thank you for tuning in. Apologies for being 2 minutes late. We are going to get right started into hopefully jumping into introducing the director and having you get some answers to your questions. So just wanted to walk you through a couple of sort of housekeeping items. As you know, we had this posted over a week ago, and we started receiving and accepting questions from members of the Toronto Catholic community. So we do have a number of pre-submitted questions that we will be going through. It is Facebook Live, and so we're going to do our best to also take questions as they come in and perhaps getting to some of the commentary there as well. We will have another opportunity, as we have promised, to try to make this as regular as possible, ideally once a month, to give the Toronto Catholic community an opportunity to engage with the director and ask questions. As you know, the reorganization is an issue I know a lot of families have questions about. And so there's a number that we received today that will be focusing on answering questions you have related to that. And the director will have an opportunity to respond to those. So I also just wanted to quickly touch on a couple of other items here. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to jump into introducing our director. So without further ado, going to introduce Director Brendan Browne. As you know, he joined us just in September. And you may have had a couple of opportunities to meet with him and to hear him speak at some of our board meetings. I'm going to turn it over to the director.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Shazia. It's great to be with everybody today on a lovely Friday. Sun is shining outside, so we always have to look on the bright side and look forward to engaging with communities today. I just before we start, I do appreciate this opportunity. We're a big school system. You know, we've got 200 schools from Scarborough across to Etobicoke to North York, and this opportunity is a chance to connect. I'm trying to get up to schools as much as I can. I'm trying to connect in communities, but I just really appreciate people tuning in today to have a quick conversation and hopefully be able to answer a few questions that are on people's radars, and I'll provide the best perspective I can.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So like the last time, if you had joined us, what we did is, based on the number of questions that came in, we grouped them into a number of themes. So we have a few themes here this afternoon that we're going to go through. The first is related to school reorganization. We have a number of questions related to Toronto Public Health and health and safety. And we have a bunch of questions related to equity and inclusion. So as I mentioned, we're going to try our best to get through all of the pre-submitted questions as well as reviewing questions as they're coming in. If you don't hear a question directly being asked, I may just be grouping that. So please just keep that in mind and bear with me. So we're going to jump right into this. School reorganization director. The first question comes from April. Why is the class cap in the virtual school at 30 students and 32 students in-person learning for grades 4 to 8?
Thanks, April. And I'm going to try to be as succinct as I can to try to get in as many questions as I can. And for those of you that know me, that's not the easiest thing for me. Sometimes I can talk for a while, so I'll try to be as quick as I can. We are following the collective agreement. There are numbers that are within the collective agreement in terms of how big our classes can be. So we do have in the collective agreement of 31 students for grades 4 to 8. And for the most part, we try to, our classes in virtual school for the most part are at the cap. Obviously, we don't have the same constraints when it comes to trying to be thoughtful around physical distancing in a virtual space. And we also were faced with making sure that we were trying to provide a teacher for all of our students when we were struggling with a little bit in the spring. So a lot of our virtual schools are maxed out at that. In class, in our combined schools, we have a class cap of 29. When the question, so I hope that answers that question, but when the question says, well, what about this class that has 32? There are in the collective agreement and provisions being that after a certain date in the school year, when we receive a new student, we can pierce the cap a little bit more so in order to not be disruptive. So to make it as easy as possible, if your son or daughter is in a class and they're in that class that happens to be a maxed out class, and then somebody moves in and comes in the area in October, there is some flexibility to add that extra student to that class so that we're not reorganizing the whole class as a result. It's order to provide stability as much as we can. So I recognize saying that the idea of trying to minimize disruption at a time in which we are doing reorg, but that's the idea, is that we do have flexibility after a certain time. It's to try to remain as stable as possible within our class sizes.
All right, there was a follow-up question as well. Director, can you guarantee that there will be no additional staff movements for in-class learning for the rest of the school year?
I would certainly acknowledge the reason why this question is asked, and I was certainly asked this by trustees last week in the board meeting as well. I don't know that anybody can guarantee anything. We're working through a pandemic right now. Things are changing all the time, and we're doing our best to try to be as stable as possible. What I will say and what I will commit to is that we are going to try to be as the least disruptive possible moving forward. We recognize that what we have just gone through in sort of a reorganization perspective has been disruptive. We recognize that we struggled to get the number of teachers that we needed for the virtual school. And then when we had our opportunity for people to make the shift from in-school to virtual, we had between elementary and secondary almost 3,000 students. We had to find a way to staff those students. So reorg was required in that case, but we are sincerely hopeful that now that this is landing, that there will be some stability moving forward. Things happen in any school year for a multitude of reasons, from personal situations with teachers and situations where there is disruption. What we're trying to do is make sure moving forward we have the least amount of disruption possible. We certainly recognize that these last couple of weeks have been difficult. We are really comfortable and confident with our amazing teachers and our wonderful principals who are landing this in schools throughout the system, but we do realize it's been a challenge. We have, through this reorg, we have remained committed to the areas that we've identified as hotspots. Those are those areas with the highest levels of transmission. We know that through Toronto Public Health and with our quintiles. And those are the schools that those caps that we committed to remain in place. But we just couldn't maintain the staffing levels in some schools as we had so many students moving into virtual. So to answer the question, can I guarantee that in-person learners will not lose any additional staff? That's not a guarantee that I could make in any year. But what I can say is that we're going to do the best we can to be as stable as possible moving forward.
Thank you for that answer. Next question is from Xavier. The Toronto Catholic District School Board received approximately $3.4 million from the Government of Ontario. That was to support smaller class sizes and create greater physical distancing in schools. Can you please tell us how those dollars were used?
Well, first of all, we hired, sorry, thanks for the question, Xavier. I'll say that to Xavier, and April was the last one. Thanks for people for asking. We're glad that when we're doing this, that people are engaging. So thanks for that. We have hired almost 400 more teachers than we've been funded for in order to run two systems. We've been running a virtual system and we've been running face-to-face. So we have gone well over what we have been funded for in order to try to create the best scenario possible to get. We have been spending, we had about a $45 million, actually almost $49 million budget that was put toward the return to school plan. And we spent on things like, we spent on portable hand washing stations, HEPA filters, plexiglass, things that were not mandated by the ministry. These are decisions that we made in order to try to increase safety. You referenced specifically $3.4 million to keep smaller class sizes. And we did make a commitment in those highest transmission school areas to cap our classes at 20 in 4 to 8 and 15 in our primary grades. We're obviously not funded for that. So that was our way to keep those class sizes small. And that was a commitment that was made at the board level. We are thankful for the ongoing leadership of our trustees who really are always advocating for making sure that they are involved and engaged and supporting in every way they can. This was one of those ways in which $3.4 million, really is about 30 teachers. So we obviously spent way more than that in order to keep our class sizes smaller. But that commitment to those high quintile areas is made based on data. And actually the data as it's been coming in, as cases have been coming, and everyone who's on this call has been certainly following how they've been increasing around the province and certainly around Toronto. About over 50% of them are from those high incidence areas. So it does really reveal that priority that's been made to those areas is actually backed by the data. And that is how we spent our money to keep class sizes smaller as best we could. So A, we were already well over in order to run 2 systems. B, we made those commitments to keeping class sizes smaller in the areas that have been identified that needed it the most. And we continue to spend money in order to do the best we can with the money that we have. I think that answers the question. I'll leave it there so I can move on.
Thanks for that. Next question is related to secondary students. So why is it that secondary students who have selected the virtual option are not being transitioned to the St. Anne virtual school, but rather are remaining as part of their home school and being offered a remote option?
Thanks for that. I thank you I love your questions, because I really do feel like we're able to hopefully provide some clarity on some of the things that have come up. That was a result of the feedback that we got when we gave people the option if they wanted to move. So we promised that we would give people the opportunity to indicate if they wanted to move between panels. And as I'd mentioned, we had, I think at the secondary level, was in around the 1,500 students that wanted to move from face-to-face into virtual. So when we got that data, it was certainly more than we expected, and it's a big number. So when we looked at the number of teachers that we'd have to pull from face-to-face school and move into virtual school in order to accommodate, we really started to realize that it was limiting our ability to offer appropriate courses for students. So to put it in context for people this way, every secondary teacher teaches 6 courses. So for all intents and purposes, for every 1 teacher that we moved from face-to-face to virtual, that was worth 6 courses. So if we moved 10 teachers, that's 60 courses. So we were limiting our ability to be able to offer students with that breadth of programming. So we were faced with a difficult situation. We wanted to be able to honor people's choice and able to move into virtual, but we wanted to not remove any more teachers from our secondary schools in order to offer course choices and make sure that we can keep teachers in the building, because that creates safety and supervision as well. In conversation with our partners, our teaching partners, and our principals, we were looking at the way the model is set up in secondary school. And there is a cohort model in secondary school. In Toronto, we're part of one of those areas that has to offer, and it's called an adaptive hybrid model. So students that are in their home school face-to-face, they go to school every other day. So I have a daughter in grade 9, as maybe this is a good example. So she might be in school Monday morning, Wednesday morning, and every other Friday. And then the other days in the afternoon, she's doing sync. So when we looked at it, we were looking at ways in which, when it came down to it, we only had to make up to allow students to remain in their home school. We were basically asking teachers to work synchronously, or to use their own professional judgment to find ways in which they could allow that student to remain at home for those 2 or 3 half days a week, or essentially 1 out of 5 days a week, in order to allow them to stay so we could keep our course offerings stable, and also to go back to the last question, to have the least amount of upheaval possible. So we are thankful that our teachers really responded, our principals responded. This was a way to limit the amount of back and forth in secondary, and also to make sure that we can continue to offer the courses that we could offer. So that's the secondary. I know that this wasn't the question, but as I mentioned, elementary, it's more difficult in elementary because, as I said, in secondary, we were looking to make up students who were really only face-to-face here in Toronto, 2 half days a week, sometimes 3 half days a week. Looking at ways to make that up is doable, especially given the independence level of secondary students and the ways in which we're already in an online environment. In elementary school, they're there 5 days a week. So the idea of doing a virtual or a hybrid model in elementary, certainly making up 5 days a week is a much different conversation. So that's perhaps why we didn't do that in elementary. We remain with the virtual model in elementary, but that's the gist of the secondary hybrid model.
Thank you for that. So we have a question here from a parent at St. Edward's. They're asking, rather than pulling teachers from in-person learning and putting them in the virtual school, why can't the board just hire more teachers so that they can teach the virtual students?
Yeah, thanks for that. I wish it was that simple too. I definitely do. I think I've said it this way before. It's difficult to spend money we don't have to hire teachers that don't exist. We've had a challenging spring. I think that most people recognize how we were struggling to fill our spots in our virtual school. We had students in virtual school that didn't have teachers well into the fall, which is very difficult for us, obviously, because of our obligations and thinking about every student and our commitment to making sure that we get a teacher to every student. So we, as I mentioned earlier, we've hired almost 400 more teachers than we were funded for. And we are one of 72 school boards across the province. And I can tell you that every school board is in a similar position, hiring more long-term occasional teachers, hiring more teachers in order to fill these positions. What that's done is it's shrunk the pool of available teachers significantly. So as we were simply trying to hire more teachers to fill virtual spaces in the fall, we were finding we were hiring teachers and then they were perhaps moving to a neighboring board because they've got a full-time position, or people were leaving and taking positions elsewhere. It's a simple supply and demand situation in which the pool of available teachers has shrunk so dramatically because the need for teachers has increased so dramatically across the province. So we are already spending well over what we've been funded for to hire teachers, well beyond what we have a budget for already. But even if we could continue to spend more beyond what we've already spent beyond, we are really struggling to find teachers to do so. So we have been working with, we've been hiring and bringing back teachers that have been retired. We've been talking with Teachers College to be looking at teachers who are in their second year for doing practicums. We're really trying to be as creative as possible to try to fill as many positions as we can. But that's the reality that we have. If it was as easy as continuing to go over budget, or we have the budget, just hire more teachers, believe me, we wouldn't be interested in creating a reorganization. We did it because we had to. We did it because we weren't able to secure more teachers, just like every other board in the province is struggling to be able to secure more teachers. And we really have a commitment to trying to provide a stable way forward for as many students as possible.
Thank you. I'm noticing we have a couple comments. Want to say hello, Catherine. Thanks for joining. I know we have a trustee here, Trustee DePasquale. Thanks for joining this afternoon. We have a question here from, I actually grouped this one. We had a couple of questions from a couple parents in a few schools related to increases of students in their child's class. So there's a question here from a parent at St. Bonaventure and a parent at Joseph Cardinal Slippe, asking, they were notified by the school that the board made a decision to reduce teaching staff at the school. Can you explain how it makes sense that their child's class size has increased, and what does Toronto Public Health say about this?
Sure. Well, so thanks for asking, actually looping in Toronto Public Health. That's a really important part. So let me loop back to that. So I think I can answer that certainly in the ways in which I've been answering the last couple of questions, is that we were in a position where we have been mandated to provide options for both virtual learning and for in-class learning. As we have, maybe the easiest way to say it is that we're funded per student. So we are given the amount of teachers, the ability to assign teachers based on what we have. When we have students in face-to-face and then they move to virtual, teach them in virtual. And we need someone to teach them in virtual, but they've moved from face-to-face where that teacher is. What's happening with us is that, and certainly this doesn't apply across the system, but we did have situations in which we have classes with quite low numbers. And we did have to think about ways in which we had to increase class sizes because we needed to move teachers from face-to-face in order to serve those students in virtual. When it comes to Toronto Public Health, we do everything in partnership with Toronto Public Health. I recognize that this has caused a lot of concern. You mentioned St. Bonaventure. You mentioned Joseph Cardinal Sleepe as kind of grouping these questions together. I recognize in my daughter's school is the same, that they are going through the same thing. What we tried to do, there's 167 elementary schools in our system. We tried to limit the impact as much as we could. When we ran the numbers, basically very simply put, how many teachers can we reduce in order to move into virtual school was much higher than that. We did a lot of by hand work to try to make sure that we were lessening the impact. As much as we could, we tried to limit it to one staff member in those schools that are affected. And it really was only just over 75, I think, schools out of the 167 that were affected. Now, that's a system perspective. Obviously, if it's your son or daughter's classroom, that the fact that there was half the system wasn't impacted, I recognize doesn't matter. We do have the caps that we put in place, and we also been talking a lot with Toronto Public Health and a lot with the ministry. The reality is that the ministry and Toronto Public Health are recognizing that schools are doing a really good job, that schools are limiting spread within communities, that when we see cases of COVID, there's very few instances of transmission within the schools. And really, schools are doing a really good job when it comes to the protocols that we're putting in place. So Toronto Public Health does recognize the need for us to do this. We continue to prioritize our safety measures and our protocols that we've put into place. We know that this has caused upset, and we absolutely recognize it and we empathize. But we know that with the leadership of our teachers, we will move this forward because we recognize that we want to make sure that every student has access to a teacher in ways in which is going to support their learning. We are continuing to look at those ways in which we can support the ways we've gone above and beyond with the HEPA filters and the plexiglass and the different ways in which we're supporting in those classes. But Toronto Public Health is aware. Toronto Public Health recognizes the good things that we're doing and also recognizes that the situation that we're in. So the decision that we had to make system-wide, and we recognize that some communities are challenged by it, and we appreciate it. But it is at times like this, we appreciate being able to move through this together and move through this in partnership as best we can. And as difficult as it is, we know that we'll get through this in partnership.
Thank you. There was a question here about there's some cases on the TCDSB COVID advisory or the dashboard, as some people are calling it, that seem to be or have been on there for quite some time. Can you tell us when a case is posted and when a case moves into resolved?
Sure. So we try to notify and get that information out as soon as we can. As soon as we have that information that goes out from the principal to the community, we want to make sure parents have good information as soon as possible. And also, there has been an increase in the ability of principals to use the best information they have to make local decisions if they need to, look at possibly asking a cohort to isolate. That is within a principal's purview based on the information they have. Information that gets up on the dashboard as soon as we have it confirmed from Toronto Public Health. As soon as they do a lot of their work and their investigations, they work very closely with our team. We have a COVID lead here at Toronto Catholic. And as soon as we have that information, that gets posted up onto the website. And as soon as that case is resolved, we also, the way that our dashboard is, actually goes above and beyond what other dashboards of other boards are around the province, in that we do list the resolved cases. And as soon as we have an indication, we do see that as something to feel good about, something that would indicate that there was a case of COVID in the community, but that now has been resolved. And that is something that we put up as soon as we have a confirmation of that.
Great, thanks for that. I have a question here from someone asking about, there are some schools that have a high number of positive cases. There on the dashboard, you can see, for instance, Chaminade. Why are those schools not being closed? Why are those schools still continuing to run?
Yeah, this is an often asked question, and it is perhaps a difficult one to understand, because you can see numbers rising. You would think that, hey, there's something going on here, we need to get involved. So the first thing that I would say is that we do everything in partnership with Toronto Public Health. we don't go and make decisions outside of the advice of Toronto Public Health. COVID, and certainly in schools, is a partnership between what we do in education, how we can serve, but how we can serve within our scope of practice as educators. We also recognize the scope of practice of public health and really rely on their expertise and experience in order to help to make good decisions for the right reason. At a school that has perhaps a high number of cases, the key that we're looking at when it comes to closure is that has any of the cases been transmitted at school? So perhaps I could use this opportunity to talk about when they determine an outbreak and whether or not an outbreak necessarily leads to a school closure. So first of all, there are schools that have a confirmed case of COVID, be it a student or a staff member. And in a school, we could have 9 cases of COVID, but none of them are connected. That basically means in a school of, say, 700 students, 9 different students or staff have walked in with COVID and left again, but there was no transmission at the school. So that would mean that, yes, there are 9 cases in the school, but with Toronto Public Health's contact tracing and investigation, if they've not found any evidence of transmission or spread, those remain 9 unique cases, even though they're in the same community. So in such a case, there might be a recommendation that a cohort is isolated or a few cohorts are isolated, and that's done with Toronto Public Health's contact tracing, but that doesn't necessarily mean the school is closed based on the numbers. An outbreak is determined when there is evidence that there has been transmission within the school, in our case. So you could have a case that there's 9 individual cases and there's no outbreak, and you can have a case in a school where there's 2 cases, but there was transmission at the school, and that would be an outbreak. So I really want to share that because the volume of does not necessarily mean an outbreak. And I recognize that the number increases anxiety, but if there is no evidence of any transmission within the building, that means that, well, first of all, it means that our staff and students are following all the protocols, doing all the things that they've been asked to do. It means that in a certain situation, 9 cases of COVID have walked into the building and they've not spread. And that's kudos to our staff and our students and our parents for the ways in which we're adhering to our protocols and we're adhering to our safety measures that we put in place. So a huge thank you to our staff for doing so. But an outbreak is when inside of a building there might have been transmission. But an outbreak does not necessarily mean a school is being closed. So there could be evidence of transmission at the school, and that could result in a cohort of students being asked to isolate, or many cohorts of students being asked to isolate. We've had as many as 9 classes in a school, all being asked to isolate for a period of time, yet the rest of the school remained open, and those cases ended up being resolved. So to the extent that I can on this live broadcast and that you could share with people and ask in your community, it really is less about the number of cases and it's more about evidence of transmission at the school. The closure of a school would be if, in the opinion of Toronto Public Health, after they've done their investigation, that there is evidence of widespread transmission and the potential for further widespread transmission. We've not been in that spot here in Toronto Catholic. In terms of, we did have one closure earlier, and that was a unique situation. But I believe there have only been, I think there's only been 5 across the entire province, all 72 school boards, in which an entire school has been closed. So very rare. We do feel like we can meet the needs and isolate cohorts as best we can. The principals have that ability to do so as well. And I realize I've spent more time on this question than perhaps any of the other ones, but I really wanted to be as clear as possible. The number of cases in a school does not necessarily dictate school closure and or how safe it is. It does reflect the ways in which protocols are working in order to reduce transmission. An outbreak is when a case is done, there's a case of transmission within the school, doesn't necessarily mean a closure. And a closure is only done in partnership with Toronto Public Health, using their advice and their advocacy for closure. I hope that clarifies, because I know that's a big question.
Thanks for the comprehensive response. So I might just pick up on some of the things you said there. Based on sort of your response to that question, can you tell us what some of the numbers are telling us? Looking at the Toronto Catholic School Board's dashboard, active cases, resolved cases, what are those numbers telling us?
I think you've got me, but I believe I mean, we meet every day. So I think we've got 152 active cases right now. I want to say 215 to 220 have been resolved. So we talk about that as a good news story. That's ways in which, we recognize that it's come into a building, we've responded appropriately, and they've been resolved. So about 152 active cases right now, about 215 to 220 have been resolved. I would speak to, because I actually mentioned this in my last answer, our evidence is telling us that there is very low incidence of spread at the schools. I recognize the high anxiety throughout the system around when we have a confirmed case, but there has been very few. So as I mentioned, 152 active cases and 218 resolved. We've had very few. I mean, in the 3 to 4 range of any confirmed cases of a spread being at the school, and they still have been contained. So very, very few incidents of spread. We talked a little bit about trying to prioritize some of those schools in which there are higher incidents of transmission, and we talked about it. Some of our quintile 5 schools, we were prioritizing class sizes through the trustee motion in those schools. And I would say that 62% of our cases, of our confirmed COVID cases, are in schools that are in either quintile 4 or quintile 5. But 41 or 42% of all of our cases that we've had so far have actually been in the quintile 5 schools. So that would tell us that the data that we were acting on when we were making decisions early in the fall would suggest that that is good data in terms of where we need to continue to focus our attention. 40% of our cases are with students in kindergarten to grade 3. So I think I said a version of this on the last Facebook Live, in that it's interesting because we do spend a lot of time, and some of the earlier questions were talking about, making sure we get class sizes as low as possible. And I know there's a huge attention out there on this is the answer. The answer is we have to have the lowest class sizes. That's the answer. We think that that is one of the answers, but we also think that a lot of the other things that we're doing are having a tremendous impact, because over 40% of our cases are in our kindergarten to grade 3 school classes, and our kindergarten to grade 3 classes are all below 20 students. They're actually in the 16 to 17 students on average in kindergarten to grade 3. So in those schools that actually have the lowest class sizes, it represents almost 40% of our cases. And we can extrapolate different reasons for why that would be the case. Certainly, the younger the students are, the more difficult it is to really be vigilant about those routines and keeping them apart. But it does speak to the idea that class size in and of itself is not the only answer. So we continue to do the work that we need to do in order to be as safe as possible. 82% of our cases, I believe, are students. So most of our cases, the vast majority of our cases, are students. We have had some cases where the COVID has come in where it's come from staff, but that's about 18%. So about 80% of them are students. So that's a little bit of data. Hopefully, those not only data, but also a little bit of context and perspective.
Thanks for that. So can you tell us what happens when a child's cohort is asked to self-isolate? What does that mean for a family? What does it mean for the student?
So thanks. The class is asked to remain at home. The idea is to not be out in the community and not have the opportunity to be interacting until we know that those students are safe, that there has been no transmission whatsoever. When we know that somebody has contracted COVID, and when we find that out, what TPH does with their investigation, their contact tracing, is they try to identify individuals that might have had the potential for close contact. So we asked them to stay home in order to make sure that we're as safe as possible for a period of time. What happens is we transition into remote learning. So we've been finding that has actually been going quite smoothly, all things considered, where the teacher then, we've asked all of our teachers throughout the system to be on Brightspace or Google Classroom, to be using it in a real way, in real time, in face-to-face learning, so that when we do pivot, if we do have to, let's say, isolate classroom, that happens overnight. That can happen, starting the next day. And that the expectation then is that teachers are engaging with their students from in a remote environment during that time of isolation. So we're trying to make sure that there's no gap in learning. We're trying to make sure that we are as thoughtful as possible with our staff to make sure that they are able to pivot and able to make sure that they can address student needs from a home as quickly as possible. And I'm really happy and proud to report that we've been really intentional about this. We have had to isolate many classes, and we have done so.
Thanks for that. We have a lot of, we actually received a lot of questions asking whether or not the board is going to consider closing schools before or after the Christmas break.
There's a lot recently, and I would think that folks on the call have seen the statement from the minister around this recently. We so myself as director and the trustees, we don't have the authority to alter the school year calendar as a school board when it comes to reducing the number of days. The authority that I have to close a school resides within the Education Act in areas in which there's an emergency. So the idea that there's a fire in the building, snow days, for example, those are ways in which I have the ability as a director to close a school, but that's because there's some sort of danger emergency in place. There wouldn't be a proactive school closure based on COVID wouldn't be something that we would have the authority to do. So that's why this decision and these conversations did rest with the ministry. I do know that they were considering this for all the ways that I'm sure you know as well, every parent out there that's on this. And the decision that they issued around this was the thinking in collaboration with the Ministry of Health that the best thing would be for students to remain with the school year calendar. So while conversations certainly have been happening about it, I would want parents to know that the decision to close schools before or after Christmas for any of length of time would not be within the authority of myself as a director or the board.
Thanks for that. We have a question here from a member of the Toronto Catholic community, York. I've heard of instances where a child or a teacher who has family members quarantined from COVID exposure or have symptoms and are awaiting tests are allowed to go to school as long as they themselves aren't showing any symptoms. Is there a policy behind this, and what's the rationale for that?
Sure, that's definitely evolved over time, and the question is actually an accurate summation of. So if a student who is quarantining because they have symptoms, there is no mandate that other people in the household have to stay home until there is a confirmed case. If there is somebody in the household that has a confirmed case of COVID, then they are asked to stay home. But when we are talking about symptomatic and waiting, so I'll try to give an example. If in my family, I have a wife and two daughters, if one of my daughters was symptomatic and we kept her home, but we didn't have any symptoms and there was no positive case of COVID, there would be no requirement for the rest of us to stay home until COVID was confirmed or until we were symptomatic. So that is from Toronto Public Health. We do, again, take all of our direction from Toronto Public Health, but this is also coming from the Ministry of Health as well.
Thanks so much. This has also been in the news, so I know we got a couple of questions about this. So related to snow days, And if our board had a snow day, would we do something similar to what a board in Waterloo is doing, essentially, which would be canceling snow days and shifting to remote learning?
We are talking about that right now, so I don't actually have something to share on that at the moment. We talk closely with our partners in the Toronto District School Board as well around these issues. We have not landed on that yet. Certainly, we want to make sure that everybody is as safe as possible, and recognizing that disruptions to school closures are challenging for families. What I've come to recognize, understand as a director, is that on the issue of snow days, there is no answer that keeps everybody happy. There's always issues of safety, and there's always issues of, whether we should or we shouldn't. In terms of making sure that students are continuing to learn if we're staying home, I would say that we're in a different space now. I would say that we are a lot more comfortable with the learning that we are in at the moment, but I am not, we haven't landed on what we're going to do with snow days as of yet. And when we do, we'll absolutely be communicating as clearly and quickly as possible.
Great, thanks for that. So it's a nice transition. I know we touched on the reorganization, we touched a bit on health and safety. We have a couple more questions that are coming in on Facebook Live, which I'll try my best to get to as well. There is a question, I think, that sort of fits in nicely with where you just left off, Director, and it's related to what's being done at the board to help schools that are harder hit due to COVID.
So I think, as I mentioned, and thanks for referencing some of my stats from earlier, we did identify earlier at the beginning of the year how we were going to prioritize schools that we would call our Q5 or quintile 5 schools. And these are schools that are in the area with evidence of higher transmission. So one way in which we prioritized some of those harder hit areas was we committed from the get-go to create our own caps. So as I'd mentioned earlier, caps of 1 to 15 for kindergarten to grade 3, and 20 for grade 4 to grade 8 in those areas that are hardest hit. Now, we're not funded for that. That comes at a cost. When we are lowering class sizes, that means we need more teachers. So that was a way in which we made a big financial commitment to be able to try to reduce class sizes in those areas. We really want to make sure that we're supporting, and when it comes to issues of equity, that we're looking at where is our areas of greatest need. And then when we look at those areas of greatest need, how can we support in the best ways that we can? So that really is working closely with Toronto Public Health, identifying those areas of higher transmission, and really looking at those cap sizes of 15 and 20. We've also been really thoughtful in some of those harder hit areas, recognizing the importance of access to good nutrition. So we've been really looking at our nutrition programs across the board through this new lens of COVID, looking at grab and go approaches to make sure that students, when they come to us, are coming and they have an opportunity to be well fed, to be able to start their day off with the food they need to do well. And those are areas in which we continue to focus on and continue to provide support to those hardest hit areas. And really our enhanced screening processes, our hand washing stations, making sure that on schools where there's a floor where there was no washroom, for example, we installed hand washing stations. We try to put processes in place to make sure that we are that we're providing opportunities for regular good protocols, physical distancing, daily screening, those sort of things. We're doing that across the system, but perhaps in intentional ways in some of those hardest hit areas.
Thanks for that. I'm seeing a couple of questions and comments. One, I know we just got a question in here from Michelle. You may have just joined us a bit later. Apologies if you did join at the beginning. I do believe the director did touch on this quite at length, actually, earlier as we started. This session, I should share with everyone, is being recorded and will be made available to everyone through our Facebook page. So you can watch, and if you missed any of our responses, you'd have an opportunity to hear those. So I wanted to jump to another question. We had a parent, Joan, who submitted a question around BIPOC students being underrepresented in the curriculum and textbooks. And so how are they supposed to learn if they don't necessarily see themselves reflected? What is the board doing to address this?
The question, Joan, and it's ways in which I'm I know that we're really engaging this work now, starting to do so in very intentional ways, and I'm very proud to be doing so. We would agree actually with the way that you asked the question. We want to make sure that all of our students see themselves in the curriculum. They see themselves reflected in how they're learning, and that our communities and the variety of communities that we are blessed to have here in Toronto and celebrate, that our students feel included and that they see themselves in the books that they're reading, in the courses that they're taking, and the things that they're studying. So we're going about that in a few different ways, and thanks for asking the questions. So I'll touch on them briefly. We've made a big commitment this year to be very intentional and lead into our commitment around supporting anti-Black racism, making sure that we are trying to address anti-Black racism very particularly by naming it, by talking about we're here to serve all students, and also recognizing that who are the areas that are continue to be marginalized and continue to be underrepresented, and how can we best support them. Ways in which we've done so already this year is we took the opportunity, as an example of my earlier statements about making sure students see themselves in the curriculum and see themselves in what we're learning, is we took an intentional approach on this year when we celebrated in partnership with our community partners on the African Canadian Advisory Committee and our work within our equity department. We looked at Remembrance Day through an Afrocentric lens. We put a webcast together. We gave resources out to the system to be able to take a look at very specifically the contributions of Black Canadians to peacekeeping, to areas of wartime, in order to maintain peace and safety in their contributions, that we remember them in very particular and intentional ways. And it was an example in a way in which how we can look at what we want to do, something like Remembrance Day, in a very unique perspective, so that we can do so that students see themselves. We're taking a look right now intentionally about, we've put together a committee to be looking at, number one, the texts that we are using in our classrooms, certainly in our English classes, making sure that we are thoughtful about increasing the use of texts written by racialized authors that about subjects that include and are about the variety of communities that we have in the system. So we're doing a bit of an inventory, actually, and taking a critical look at not only at the books that we're using in our classes, but also the books that we're using in our library. We have just established a race relations committee that is involving members of our trustees, members of the public, and that's something that we are moving forward this year to help to continue to inform our decision-making. We are looking really intentionally at our policies, using the lens of equity with our human rights and advisory, human rights and equity advisor, which we have, to be looking at all of our policies and processes, to be making sure that we're being culturally sensitive and that we are not perpetuating any stereotypes and continuing to disproportionately marginalize particular populations within the Catholic School Board. We are also engaging in some virtual town halls with members of our Black community. We really want to hear experiences. We want to hear feedback. We want to hear voice from our communities, from our students and members of our communities about their experiences and ways in which can inform our way to move forward together. So I mentioned all this in the context of a few minutes of an answer. I could spend an hour on this, but I'm happy to address it because this work happens when we do so intentionally. We have been very intentional, and I hope that you had a chance to read the very public proclamation that I put out on social media and certainly out to the media to talk about our intentional commitment to dismantling anti-Black racism here in the Toronto Catholic District School Board, using the ways in which we're intentionally doing so with our Remembrance Day this year. But our commitments to doing this work was something that we were talking about very publicly and something we're very committed to doing. We know that this is a process, but we're committed to doing it together.
Thanks so much for that. I know we have just a few more minutes left. We have a couple questions I still want to try to get to, Director. We had 2 additional questions that came in just before this session started, and there's a question here on Facebook. I see that's been sent again, so I'd like to get to that as well. While we're on the theme of diversity and inclusion and equity, I wanted to ask, there's a question here from someone, TDSB has started with data collection. Why has Toronto Catholic not done so?
Actually, that is something that we are in the process of doing. That we recognize that having good data is something that is really important to help us with informed decision making. I come from a research background. I really like to know what does our data tell us, because when I'm looking at the experiences throughout the system and what our data is telling us throughout the system, we hear certain voices, but I also want to know who are the voices that we're not hearing from. When we hear about students, succeeding, who are the students that are not succeeding? And how can we get into the margins and make sure that we're addressing their work? And we do that through data collection. So that is something that we're working with our equity department and our research department now. We're looking to launch the first phase of our data collection, our student census, to be looking at identity-based data in the spring, and then certainly moving into the fall as well, to have a robust understanding of who are our students, who are our staff, and then how are we doing in those areas. So once we know who our students are from a data collection perspective, now we're looking at impacts. What are the outcomes? And then how can we look at changing those outcomes? So I'm glad you asked the question, because I'm happy to talk about ways in which we are publicly committed to doing this work, to collecting identity-based data and using that for decision-making moving forward.
Thanks for that. So I know we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to go to a question we received on Facebook Live. I'm going to try my best to summarize it. And then we have another question that I had received, like I said, before the start. So it looks like it's a question related to in-person students learning, staff and their families, and the impact related to the reorganization. So has the board looked at other solutions? There are some suggestions here around installing webcams in classrooms to allow for both in-person and virtual learning. There is comments here around limitations to a merged approach, but also sort of balancing that with the amount of students that are in a classroom. I know, Director, you answered a bit of this earlier, but this question has appeared again. So just wanted to know if you could comment on whether or not this is something the board is exploring.
I would start off by saying I wish there was an elegant solution that solved all of the issues. And I recognize that there are lots of different potential solutions that people have and that other boards are trying. And we're learning from each other. We recognize that looking to our neighbors to the east and west and north of us and finding out what they're doing, and we're in very close contact with our other boards. I meet with the directors of all the Catholic boards every week. I meet on a small group of directors from Catholic, public, and French boards to speak with the deputy minister and the minister on a weekly basis. And we are learning from what we're doing in all these different situations. When you talked a little bit about, just putting cameras in classrooms and that sort of thing, in some school boards and their ways in which they're trying to take that sort of an approach. We're always trying to think about what's the impact going to be on students. When we simply look at setting up a camera in a classroom and having a teacher teach to the students who are in the classroom, we do have to be thoughtful about what's the experience for the students who are simply watching passively at home, and how is that actually working. That's not to say no, we do want to know more about that, and we are looking at what that looks like. But we do have to keep in mind that a student that's sitting in front of a laptop at home watching a teacher teach somebody else, from a pedagogical perspective, it's a challenge. From a technological perspective, the question asked setting up cameras in classrooms. We did, and we have looked at the financial implications to be setting up every classroom in the system. And as you can imagine, 200 schools to be beyond, putting a laptop in a room and just pointing it at a teacher, to be having any sort of cams in the classroom, we are talking about a different level of commitment. So it is something that we're looking at. We're basically looking at all options. All options are always on the table. But I actually go back to what I said at the beginning of the meeting, of this conversation, is that we are trying at this point to have the least amount of disruption as possible moving forward. So hope that helps.
Thank you. I see a couple other comments here. I know, I see, Michelle, you've commented a little bit about resources for kindergarten students in the virtual school. I would encourage you to go on the St. Anne Virtual School webpage. There you'll see specific contact information that are grouped in different grades. And if you submit it that way, you will receive a response. So please do so. One of the last questions, Director, for you that came in is related to, so jumping back a little bit, related to public health and COVID. Someone has asked, would it not be possible to create lessons around COVID-19 that could be shared with students and families? It seems to be that some people aren't familiar with items related to COVID-19. Is there a policy that can be created so that parents know they need to be wearing masks when they come to school? There's a couple of other pieces here, but just wanted to know if you could comment on that.
Thanks for that. That's a great question. So I'm going to answer that in two ways. First of all, our expectation is that parents, students at school are wearing masks, and certainly anybody that's coming into the building, our expectation is parents are wearing masks. So we do. I'm happy to say that now, and certainly we continue to remind our principals of that. They'll continue to communicate that in the ways that they would normally communicate with their communities, because we're trying to do everything that we can to, and we do understand that masks are effective. So to, when they are inside, to be able to make sure that parents are wearing masks. So thank you for that. But also thank you for the education idea. I'm going to speak to that a little bit. Definitely take that back from a great idea perspective in terms of education for parents. I will say that there are also opportunities, and TPH has been great about this. They are very willing to talk to parent communities about what that means to better educate ourselves on how we can keep ourselves safe during this pandemic. So as an example, I was on a parent meeting on Tuesday evening up in the Humber Black Creek area online, and we did have Dr. Vanita Dubé and Nicole Welsh from Toronto Public Health, and they went through a great educational session for parents based on best tips, strategies, practices, increasing education. So that is something that they're very willing to do. They do them, so please keep an eye out on Toronto Public Health, making sure that this was promoted through our trustees in the Humber Black Creek area. But they do a lot of these info sessions, and ways in which those can continue in our communities is just a terrific idea, and one I appreciate and would concur and support.
All right. Thank you so much, Director, for taking the time to answer all the questions. We definitely were able to get through all of the questions that were submitted in advance, tried our best to get through the questions that were submitted on Facebook. You will have multiple opportunities, everyone. As I mentioned, this is the second of what we hope becomes a regular opportunity for the Toronto Catholic community to ask the director questions. So I wanted to thank everyone again for joining us. A reminder that this session has been recorded. And so if you've missed it, or you know anyone that didn't have an opportunity to tune in, wants to watch, that will be available on Facebook. We will also link that on our social media accounts. We will share in advance again the next opportunity so that you can submit questions in advance. And hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and hope you have a nice weekend. Director, I don't know if you wanted to end off with saying anything before we're done.
Just an appreciation. Thanks. I know everyone's busy, and your willingness to join me today, I really do appreciate. I'm glad to have the opportunity to say so directly. I know that there's a lot of questions out there, and we really do want you to come to us with those questions. The best answers are definitely with your school principal, your local superintendent. But if there are these system-wide issues that we can talk about, I'm happy to provide the best answer I can. So please tell people about these webcasts being put up online. We're just trying to create as transparent and informative a process as possible, so that parents are aware about our challenges, decision-making, but also what we're trying to do together as a system. So this opportunity is one I embrace, and I look forward to continuing to do so with you.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Have a nice weekend. Bye.